Hi everyone, welcome to this NWCC webinar. I see a lot of folks are getting on the phone right now at our start time, so I will get started slowly with a few logistics while folks continue to join before we dive into the presentations. This is Paige Johnson with the American Wind Wildlife Institute, and this is the NWCC webinar on preliminary results of research on wind operational impact minimization technologies, DOE-funded technology development and innovation projects. So we are going to hear some preliminary results on these projects today. So before we get started with the presentations, I have a couple of quick logistics notes. For sound, you should be able to hear us through your computer speakers, or you can follow the instructions in the webinar room to dial in. If you're having any technical trouble with the webinar, you can send us an email at support@kernswest.com, and that email address is in the notes box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can also send us logistics questions through the Q&A box in the webinar room, and we'll see them there. We will be having time for Q&A after each presentation, so if you have a question for the presenters, you can enter it into the Q&A box at the bottom right of your webinar screen. You will only be able to see the questions that you submitted in the box, not those submitted by others. So what we'll do is we'll read the questions out loud for the presenters to respond to. And you can feel free to type in questions whenever they come up, and we'll read them during the Q&A session at the end of each presentation. And finally, I would like to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar, and we will post the recording along with the presentation slides for these presentations on the NWCC site shortly after the webinar, probably by the end of the week, and we'll send out an email announcement once everything is up, and the web address of where you can find those at the NWCC website is up in your notes box as well, www.nationalwind.org. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it over to Bethany Straw, Research Project Manager with NREL, and she'll introduce a little more about the background of the projects that you'll see presented on today. So Bethany, I'll pull up your slides. And once you see your slides, you can take it away.
All right, thanks, Paige. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Paige said, I'm Bethany Straw. I've been the project manager at NREL for these two projects. And sorry, I realized I had my speakers on. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to introduce to you all, for those of you who may not be familiar, the background on the program that led to these awards and the outcomes of the projects that you'll be hearing today. The Technology Development and Innovation Program is funded by the Department of Energy and led by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And the aim of the program is to support the development, testing, and engineering of low TRL and prototype wildlife risk monitoring and impact minimization technologies to improve the number and quality of technology solutions in the technology pipeline. So we're not working in high TRL levels, and we don't see these technologies through to commercialization, but aim to advance their progress from low to mid TRL levels and support success later on through development by providing that support early in the process. The way the program has operated is that partners are selected through a competitive selection process. So NREL releases a request for proposal, and anytime the lab does so, it's posted on FedBizOps and with merit criteria, much like you would see with any other funding opportunity. And then we go through an internal peer review process. And funding under this program is apportioned between the project partner and NREL. The aim here is to forge that partnership so that researchers and technology developers are able to leverage the assets and expertise at the laboratory to support technology development and advancement. And then they then have access to the lab expertise, and we also provide funding support for testing and validation. We've awarded 3 projects to date, and the first 2 are what you'll be hearing about today, and you'll hear directly from the PIs on those projects, so I'll let them tell you about all the details there. We've also more recently awarded a 3rd project that we kicked off earlier this year with Meade Technology Corporation, and the goal of that project is to develop a self-powered ultrasonic deterrent that can be blade mounted. And they presented on an NWCC webinar in March of this year, so if you're interested in learning more about the goals of that project, you can go to the webinar library and listen to the recording and explore the slides. The 2 projects you'll hear about today, we hosted at NREL Flatirons Campus. Our Flatirons Campus is a 305-acre site south of Boulder, Colorado, up against the foothills. And the site houses lab facilities, experienced staff, research turbines, heavily instrumented MET towers, and also comes with some unique weather conditions. During the summer months, we have nice calm winds coming in from the plains, but in the winter, we get extremely high turbulent winds that are funneled through El Dorado Canyon, which is, let's see, I'll exercise the use of my pointer. And this right here is El Dorado Canyon. And as the winds come over the Rockies and down towards the plains, they increase in speed and they're extremely turbulent, and it's not unheard of to have over 100-mile-an-hour winds at our site. And these varying weather conditions, heat and intense sun in the summer and blizzards and windstorms in the winter, can provide insight into technology durability or system durability. We also, what comes along with these heavily instrumented MET towers and all the instrumentation on their site is a lot of data that is publicly accessible, and you can access it through the website listed on the bottom right, and it goes back all the way to September of 1996 through yesterday, continuously monitoring going forward. Some additional resources available at the lab include lab test facilities, advanced computing and data visualization, and diverse expertise ranging from anything like custom fabrication to high fidelity modeling. We've also hosted some projects outside of the TD&I program explicitly that assess target tracking, the accuracy of target tracking technologies by way of unmanned aerial vehicles and trained birds and falconers. But finally, one of the greatest assets of using this site is the relevant research venue and the highly qualified technicians that are staffed there. Moving through the TRL levels requires a multitude of steps, starting with fundamental and applied research to inform solution development through to full wind farm scale testing. And before getting to full or even mid-scale testing, it's important to have opportunities to identify failure points, system weaknesses, and do so in a safe and relatively low-risk venue. So through this program, we're aiming to support advancements to minimization technologies, and as part of that, provide researchers and technology developers access to a relevant environment and technician staff that can help inform things like just logistics and tactical approaches such as ideal placement, system configuration, or even weatherization needs that all contribute to advancing a technology through the TRLs. If you have interest in learning more about NREL's wind and wildlife programs, feel free to reach out to myself or Chris Hines. But I'd like to take the time to briefly introduce our speakers, Rob Deal and Paul Cryan. I've had the sincere pleasure of working with these two on these projects, and I can honestly say it has been fun. They're a great researchers and PIs to work with, and I'm excited for you all to hear about the work that they've been leading. Rob Deal is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and is primarily focused on behavior and ecology of migratory birds. And Rob will be sharing some preliminary results from his work looking at how weather radar can help support impact minimization strategies. But first, we'll hear from Paul Cryan, a research biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, primarily focused on biology and ecology of bats. Paul will be sharing the outcomes of his work investigating whether dim UV light can serve as a bat deterrent. So thanks for joining us, and I'll pass it to Paul.
Thank you, Bethany. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides, and then Paul is going to share his screen. So take it away whenever you are ready. Perfect.
Great.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody, and thank you, Bethany, for that awesome introduction, and thanks to Paige and Christina at AWWI, everybody at NWCC, DOE, NREL, and all the other wonderful people working hard behind those acronyms
Hey,
to
Paul. Sorry to
make this all
interrupt
possible.
you.
Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt you. One more note. It looks like there's a little window that is like the screen share window, and it's covering some of your text that's in the bottom right-hand corner. There we go. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Now looks good. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here and your patience with me. So I think I'll start out by explaining just what the heck a perceptible wind turbine system is. And in the parlance of patent law, we're basically talking about something that you can change so that people or animals see, hear, smell, taste, or feel it in different ways. So our work's all based on the speculation that migrating bats might visually mistake the silhouettes of wind turbines for tree trunks, basically, from afar at night, and then approach to look for food, lodging, and company they kind of expect at those natural rest stops when they're migrating in particular. So bats visually navigate in the dark as far as we can tell, and they tend to avoid lighted, developed areas. So our reasoning is that if we can change the tree-like silhouettes of wind turbine towers to something that bats may not mistake as trees, we might be able to keep them from ever approaching in the first place. So basically, we suspect that curiosity killed the bat, but first comes that confusion, and it's visual. So we've patented this selectively perceptible approach for changing the way turbines appear to approaching bats by lighting up turbine surfaces with dim ultraviolet light that's out of the spectrum that humans can see and is out of the sensitivity levels that we think birds and other animals are going to respond to behaviorally. So with our partners, we're basically, the reason we patent this is to assure that it's accessible to anyone that needs it or wants it, should it work, which is a big caveat here. So, and it all really stems from the fact that perception's in the eye of the beholder. And this is kind of key to considering how animals see at night and remembering what might be going on with these bats and the other animals we don't want to influence with behavioral manipulation. So humans and other animals perceive things really differently than the way animals do, or all animals perceive things differently. And relevant to what we're talking about today is with bats at turbines is that mammals, like humans and bats, are all kind of all over the place in terms of the color, the sharpness, and the sensitivity of their vision. But in general, as a class of animals, we evolved underground during the reign of the dinosaurs and came through it with pretty good night vision. Birds, on the other hand, were some of those dinosaurs and generally didn't have to escape into dark holes to survive. So with a few exceptions, birds generally don't have good night vision. Most birds can see crazy colors and things that we can't even imagine during the day when it's light, but there's very few that can actually see well in the dark. So there's a reason we don't see birds flying around near the ground all night and why they go to roost early in the evening. So not being able to see in the dark and wings are a pretty dangerous combination. At the same time, we know that insects can see well at night. Some insects can, and some have eye sensors, unlike anything in the vertebrates, and we'll come back to that in a sec. But the main point we're headed towards is that the differences in how we perceive the world around us lead to differences in how we respond to the information we're getting from the world around us, or in other words, how we behave. So this leaves us with a fairly limited visual abilities at night, but as far as humans go, we're not too bad in the grand scheme of things. We can't see colors in the dark, but we're one of a handful of mammals that can really see lots of colors. But it's not such a big deal at night because it doesn't really help. Bird visual capabilities are off the charts in bright light across the board, but in general, and with few exceptions like owls, nighthawks, and some of these cave birds, their vision's pretty lousy in the dark. Insect visual capabilities are complicated and still pretty mysterious. For example, we're continuing to see studies come out every year that reveal things like the multi-sensor arrays of fly eyes can obtain mammal-like resolving power when they're moving rapidly, and basically visual jitter of the signals from these multi-sensor arrays are being integrated in their tiny little brains in ways that give them good vision. And there still isn't definitive answers to things like why certain insects fly into lights and flames at night, or solar concentrating towers during the day. So there's still a lot of mystery, but regardless, what we don't know about what animals can see, we do know that bats aren't blind and then they have much more sensitive night vision than we do, albeit much fuzzier and kind of what we would consider out of focus. So going with all that, bats navigate across landscapes at night using vision. We think they might be mistaking silhouettes of wind turbines for trees. We think we can help them avoid that confusion by lighting up the surfaces of wind turbines with dim, flickering light that only bats can see, and that other animals like birds and insects aren't likely to respond to or be able to perceive. So we've done some background research on this, and if you want more details there, I'm not going to go into it, but you can check out those papers referenced down at the bottom of the slide here. So animal behavior at night is hard to predict. Humans exhibit context-specific and variable behaviors when visually perceiving lit structures in nighttime landscapes. People, the way humans respond to lit wind turbines and lighthouses can vary broadly even within the same individual. So we're really complicated, but one of the big issues is it doesn't seem to be an option to light up the surfaces of wind turbines at night so that humans can see them in an effort to keep bats or birds away. So birds and insects are somewhat more predictable, as I've been alluding to, but we're basically taking advantage of the fact that with a few rare exceptions, and where certain bats feed on insects around lights, bats generally tend to avoid lighted areas and lit structures. So, as Bethany pointed out, we're in the early stages to low to mid technology readiness levels. And basically that translates to still under development and not quite ready for wide implementation when we started. And so the primary objectives of this project were to light up turbines with UV, keep them lit through hell or high water over a whole year, and see if any animals were harmed by the process. Our secondary, or I'd say more optimistic objectives, were to improve animal monitoring methods. So how do we test a kind of experimental approach like this? To see if UV influenced bat and other animal presence near the turbines, and see how conditions influenced animal presence, like weather and other conditions of lighting and nighttime conditions. So, and then also to find new ways of integrating UV into the turbine design should it work. So Bethany gave you a little bit of information about the NWCC and NREL. I'd say it is the ideal study site for this kind of research, and we are really fortunate to have this opportunity. You've seen photos of the NWCC during those idyllic warm days, but what really thrilled me about working there was to be able to try our equipment and protocols through the fog, the bomb cyclones, and these incredible winds that come bearing down on the turbines there from all different directions. It's an ideal and the site in terms of the long history of private-public sort of entity collaboration there, the incredible staff and facilities. I'll get more into that later. And the general understanding that failure for this kind of development stage and research can be an option. So our basic layout was to monitor flying animal activity with pairs of thermal surveillance cameras mounted near the ground on the monopole of the turbine and pointing upward. These are the same cameras we've been using for years, and they hardly ever fail, and they're really easy to work, really, really reliable. We magnetically mounted them as well as the UV illuminators. We had 12 illuminators per turbine tower, magnetically mounted and pointing upward on the monopole. The lights were wired with 16-volt DC power supplies inside the base of the turbine, where we also had timers to automatically turn them on and off on the given nights they were programmed to be working at sunrise and sunset and sunrise, respectively. So I'm going to provide spoilers early and often here. So cutting right to the chase, this is the timeline of the project. We first started testing the UV lights on the turbines at the National Wind Technology Center in June of 2018. We installed them on the towers during August of 18. We watched lots of animals fly by on the thermal cameras during those first few months of installation, when we tried to figure out if the lights were actually lighting up the turbines. At the same time, there was some really inclement weather that came in later in fall. And over the course of the fall into the winter and spring, we realized that most of the lighting units had failed by spring of 2019. So we pulled them down, overhauled them, but while more bats and other animals flew past, we reinstalled the lights in time for the 2019 peak of bat activity that generally at the site goes through September, October. We then watched a whole bunch more animals fly by at night on the cameras without realizing that a circuit error in the overhauled lights had knocked most of them out as soon as we'd power them up with the wrong power supplies that I accidentally swapped out. And basically, we took the lights down last winter, and despite the pandemic and amazing competence of the staff there on site, we were able to get them up again this summer, and fingers crossed, running by late July of this year. So we plan to keep them running through October. And if they work and the cameras are recording, we might have some idea of whether lighting with UV reduces bat activity at wind turbines. But for now, because the light systems failed at the very times when the bats were occurring in sufficient numbers during the project period to make our statistician happy, we haven't yet been able to determine their actual efficacy at keeping bats away. So with that out of the way, that was mainly the punchline of the whole talk. I can focus in on the nuts and bolts of the installation and maintenance and sort of running the lights, which is really where we learned a lot and have made a huge amount of progress. So each light system was installed on a turbine in about 4 to 6 hours using a aerial lift and the extremely competent technicians at the site, like the likes of Simon Tao, who you see there in the center picture, who knows those turbines in and out. There's a bunch of techs on site, and they were all amazingly helpful. They had somewhat helpful ground support from Bethany and I, but they mostly managed it without us. And I generally say the installations went pretty quickly, including the takedowns, which we've done 3 times now. Can't praise Simon and those other techs enough. They welcomed biologists into their world of industrial energy production and showed us the ropes so we didn't get hurt or totally screw things up. And, you know, we learned, I think, a lot more from them than they learned from us. But with their help, we went from systems we'd shown up with, like the one in the upper right-hand corner that we started on, and to systems that by the end of the project were vastly improved, like that one seen in the lower right-hand side of the picture, which Simon basically put together for us after I tried. So their confidence, good humor, and patience really meant everything to me, and that was worth every moment on site I could get. So the lights were installed pointing up 20 meters above the ground on 2 turbines, both of which had 80-meter tall towers So only a quarter of the height up, but they were easy to access. They're out of rotor reach, and they lit the blades in the cell probably good enough. Our hope was that the lights wouldn't be visible to humans when we turned them on the first time, and we really didn't know what was going to happen. So in that respect, we totally knocked it out of the park. The problem we ran into was that the light on the turbines is so invisible. We're filtering out all visible light, only passing UV. The turbine paint doesn't fluoresce that much or at all. So we couldn't really tell if they were on or not. And that led us down a bunch of different rabbit holes looking for ways to verify the lights were on at night and lighting up the turbines from lots of different angles and distances. We tried modifying construction time-lapse cameras. I ended up getting into digital camera modification, kind of like a ghost hunter. But eventually we figured it out and started being able to see what the lights were doing and whether they were actually working. So fortunately, the engineering brains behind the project, Dave Dalton, had through his day job at the time a camera he invented that could image in the UV spectrum kind of down to the photon sensitivity. So getting the low intensities we're hitting the turbine surfaces with. And this is the only one of these cameras we know of in the world, so we were really fortunate to be able to borrow it from his company, Photometrics Teledyne. And with that, we were able to start seeing what these turbines look like. You'll see images here that are both from the Photometrics video camera, and so that's what the moving stuff is. And then I'd modified a DSLR camera that takes long exposure images. That's what you see on the left there. So that image is like 3 or 4 minute exposure, whereas the exposure times of the Photometrics camera on the right are merely milliseconds, or fractions of seconds, I should say. So moving along, things look really promising. I mean, we could see the lights flickering on the turbines from distances greater than 3 miles away. I spent a lot of time driving up into the foothills and looking down. We also got a look at landscapes for the first time at night in the UV spectrum to try to start kind of thinking more through what bats might be perceiving and how they navigate. It took me a while to figure out how to get the cameras to focus during windstorms and my fingers getting frostbitten at the side of the road. But after a while, we got it together, and that's kind of what part of this whole project is. After hour sessions, sitting by the side of the road outside NWCC, looking like a weirdo with a whole bunch of tripods and cameras. And eventually, we figured out that the lenses had been filtering out visible light, but were also at first letting in ultraviolet and infrared. So we eventually found a lens that let in only UV, and that's what you're seeing here with this video image from the Photometrics camera. And now we're seeing truly UV-only landscapes. And so during that first winter, we worked out all the bugs in the timers, the power supplies, the imaging devices to feel confident that we finally had the lights running and lighting up large parts of the turbines at intensity levels we think that bats can see and behaviorally respond to. So this was winter, and what you're going to see flashing through the images to the left, hopefully, are time-lapse. These are about 4-minute time-lapse long exposure images, 1 per night for about a year. You can see the lights on the turbine tower bases lighting up, alternating every night. And during the winter, things were running pretty well. It illustrates the lights were working early on. It took us a while to get our act together imaging things, but we finally now have a way to validate that the lights come on each night by using these time-lapse long exposure UV cameras we cobbled together, and they're pretty easy to make. But unfortunately, by the time spring rolled around and we got our UV-only filtering figured out, the lights had been taken down, reinstalled, and basically failed. We had 2 failures. The first one was, both of them were very simple and very explainable, which is always good for these kind of things. The first failure in the spring of 2019 was basically water had gotten into the housings because unlike most other applications Dave and I have used UV or infrared lights on, the silicone seal that we used to seal the lens coverings usually does the trick just fine, but with the lights on the turbine towers, apparently they are constantly rattling, and the vibration was enough to basically back all the camera screw lenses, the coverings off their screw mount and undo the RTV. So that was easily fixed with epoxy. We haven't since had any water incursion. The second failure was miscommunication between the electronics designers, team builders, and me with implementation, and that early on we swapped out some power supplies, and when reinstalling the second time, I used the 14-volt DC power supplies versus the 16-volt DC power supplies, and one of the new modifications they made was just such that that 2-volt difference popped a 60-cent switch in many of the lights. So as soon as we turned them on and powered them up, the second time they went out. So the lights, we now are to a point where Dave and his team have re-engineered and redesigned. We're beyond prototype. He's got the lights ready, and now that we're no longer under a cooperative research and development agreement, he can produce those and anyone that needs them. But we're to a point where the light devices themselves, they're UV, LED based, and they're sufficient for any further testing. Cameras were ironically the bright spot in this whole project. We have gone through all the imagery from a whole year of those paired cameras at each turbine. We only analyzed one camera's worth of video, but through that we found 4,000 high confidence bat detections, so that means it's definitely a bat. About 3,000 detections of flying animals too high to identify, so it could be a bird, could be a bat, we just don't know. Anyway, we get birds. The video technician who we had manually vetting the videos after using our older MATLAB code to find them, find the events with a bat in it. He was able to keep up with the whole process, although it was probably the most mind-numbing job I've ever seen anyone do. But it was also a really great experience in that as we continued using our older methods of analyzing the video for animal activity, we really put a lot more effort in the past into automating and open sourcing those computer processing methods. These are data from one of the wind turbines at NWCC during 2016 and 17 that we're currently working on publishing. But the activity patterns that we saw in the UV study, we've got all those bat data and we're making them better with automated algorithm processing right now. But basically we saw a very similar trend where you have peaks of activity. The bats really start kicking in mid-July. There's another peak in September. And you also see a diversity of behaviors kicking in at that same time. So bats chasing each other, bats coming close to the nacelle and monopole, doing multiple passes and investigations. So we really have great bat activity, and I'd say biologically relevant in the turbine context at the NWCC. Rarely, if ever, do we see strikes. We still can't really tell if they're strikes or not with the video definitively, so we call them possible strikes. But lots of that activity, so it's a great site for testing these kinds of things. We've moved beyond that old MATLAB-based approach that full-time video technician used to keep up with the processing for this UV study. But during this, thanks to Bethany and her amazing abilities to network and get people helping each other, NREL scientists John Yarborough, Mike Lawson, and intern Isabel Kunitz really led the charge and used machine learning methods to begin developing new open source software solutions for automatically detecting and classifying flying animals in thermal surveillance video, and working at processing speeds close to real time, so things we can implement on cameras instead of recording and then looking at it later. So the team's currently preparing to publish the first well-tested algorithm that resulted from that effort, which does a really good job of finding and tracking flying objects of interest in thermal surveillance scenes while ignoring moving objects that aren't of interest, so ignoring clouds and turbines, but tracking bats and other things. The team plans to continue developing and further testing the algorithm that classifies detected objects as bats, birds, insects, airplanes, or other things, whatever we want really, with high accuracy and associated error estimates. So that hopefully will be coming out in the next year. And the classifier is currently performing what's potential. We hope to improve it further over the coming years before releasing that open source code. The cameras in this project, yet again, I think, really showed the incredible potential to harness the observational power of video at wind turbines. This is a dual camera view. We finally figured out an easy way using GPS time clocks to sync the times of the cameras. This is two cameras imaging. They're each about a foot apart next to each other, looking up at bats doing weird things. And we're seeing things that, as before, we still can't really explain. But we have a lot of, we're really excited about what we might be able to do with this 3D imaging. There's already been some great efforts by Aaron Corcoran and Michael Schermacher to do 3D image analysis, and we're going to shoot for something a little less precise, but how high is the target with this imagery and the open source method we're heading into also. So stay tuned for that. And we're really excited about the idea of open source software. There's other parts of our work in USGS. We're moving into the realm of open source hardware for studying and monitoring bat populations. So there's a lot of potential for opening up these methods and bringing in scientists from a much broader range of talents and economic classes into the fold of advancing the technology by making it more affordable and accessible. And so kind of moving into the wrap up here, UV light isn't visually intrusive to humans. We can pretty much say, at least the way we implemented. It doesn't attract insect swarms, which is surprising, although there's a new paper I just saw that shows flickering UV light, or flickering light may not be as attractive to insects as steady light. And so far, from what we can tell, everything seems safe to birds that we're doing. It's not causing apparent harm and is now simple to implement. The light systems are easy to install and maintain. Operation and treatment implemented with minimal maintenance once we had the light bugs worked out. And the fundamentals of device design remain unchanged. These are extremely durable and energy efficient little units. And the cost of implementing a year-long study for this kind of efficacy test wasn't really cost prohibitive. I'll say that with the caveat that, we had this awesome opportunity and, but we've worked now for 2.5 years on pretty much $80,000 worth of funding for the UV work. And that was able to cover the technician time for about 6 months, keep our government vehicles running back and forth between the site every month or so. The UV lights and the timers were a big chunk of the cost of the project. Some of my time was covered, and then USGS, we threw in a lot of the equipment for video monitoring. Dave Dalton and his group cost shared all of the design, construction, fabrication of the light units themselves and the systems, using parts that USGS paid for. I basically got on DigiKey and ordered everything. And that was done under a cooperative research and development agreement, which we no longer are under. And Marcos, who's who's the co-brains behind this whole thing in the first place, is University of Hawaii Hilo and Pacific Islands Ecosystems Research Center through this effort, and I put in a bunch of my time cost shared. So going to the final points, we did, if I can figure out. I'd say we
Hey Paul, you're cutting out. Your audio just cut out a little bit. Could you just repeat what you were saying?
Hello? Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So primary objectives, I think we did pretty well and met them. Secondary objectives, we totally failed on the testing whether the UV light actually changes bat, bird, or insect activity, although, you know, basically because we statistically couldn't look at that. But we didn't see any indications that bats, birds, insects, or other things were attracted to the turbines or the lights when they were on. And we're going to learn a lot about how weather and turbine operation and things influence the activity and presence of bats and other animals as we dig through this data, which we will probably be doing for the next year or two, especially as these new algorithms come online for having automated ways of doing that. This couldn't have happened without a whole lot of trust by a whole lot of very diverse players in the game. It's a whole realm of institutions, backgrounds, expertises, fields, and it took a lot of sort of faith and leap of faith to work together in the first place, but it's been nothing but productive and extremely positive experience, at least for me. A few lessons learned. Leave room for correcting mistakes, because you will make mistakes. As I said, that second fail, the image on the left over there is the result of a bomb cyclone and sheets of ice sliding down across our lights, which was pretty good given that, you know, could have killed a truck. The failure we had in the switches was a 62-cent part on each light. So there's little teeny things that can change things very quickly. And it's important to plan for those unavoidable mistakes, which turn into lost sampling opportunities. You know, it's not satisfying that we can't say whether our lights keep bats away, whether they actually work, but statistical power doesn't come easy in these types of projects. And timing's everything, and those little equipment failures or unanticipated, you know, shutdowns because the turbines have to be maintained can really quickly eat into experimental schedules and, you know, screw up our statistical requirements for basically being able to say anything about our results. So plan for that. And just in general, it helps to look at the world through different lenses and think in different ways. I sure think I lost some of my vision during all this project. So what's next? I'm working on a manuscript that details the methods for UV illumination systems on turbines that include pretty much everything we did and what we learned and how to do this. I think it's now a viable technology for efficacy testing. We moved from, I think, the TDL level 5, which is development. We were probably at 4 or 5 before this started. I think we're solidly in the level 6, which is kind of ready for demonstration. Illuminators, as I said, Dave Dalton is now getting geared up and producing those for anyone that wants to test. And his email address is right here. I'll just show you that, and I encourage you to contact him if you want to try an efficacy test. And we're also available to consult on that kind of stuff, or at least advise. We're wrapping up the NWCC test, hopefully at the end of October, and we'll keep people posted on the results of that, hopefully by spring at the latest. And generally, I'm prioritizing the rapid development of open source computer vision software for this detection, classification, and characterizing behaviors and flight paths of animals in digital video. For me, it's been the most untapped and frustrating it's so easy now to collect thermal imagery surveillance video over months to years with these cameras and make these observations, but finding those observations is really key, and it's still too hard and too expensive. So I'm trying to crack that nut, and as always, we'll be keep looking for opportunities to help with that and wind turbine research. And with that, everybody at Department of Energy, Jocelyn Roth, everybody that's helped at NREL, there's so many people who have been super important to making this work, and shoulders to cry on when things go wrong, and sympathetic ears to learning as we go. Thanks to everybody, and thank you all for your time, and I'll stop there and maybe have some time for questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Okay, we've already had a few questions come in, so I'm just going to dive in, and anyone else who has any questions, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box there on the bottom right of your screen. The first question is, can you clarify if there was success in overwintering for the camera and light deployment?
Yes. Yeah, the lights and cameras without our touching them did great. The cameras, we had, I think, 1 week of video we lost. Well, we may have lost a couple of weeks while we were trying to configure them during the early phases of the project. Bethany, you can jump in and remind me, since you were the one that was usually dealing with the cameras. But the way we had the cameras set up was they were on the side of the turbine. The cable went into a laptop computer inside the base of the turbine, and each night or each morning the laptop would send all the recorded video imagery out through a really long 16-foot USB cable to a portable hard drive that was clamped in a little protective case on the outside of the turbine. So every week or two, Bethany could go swap out hard drives, or my technician, Sam Ross, could go swap out a hard drive, put a new one on, and we can go. Right now we've gone 2 months without having to change a hard drive because we're just moving to bigger hard drives in solid state. But camera failures didn't happen. We lost, I think, a chunk of October prime bat season video during 2018 because I accidentally deleted it while showing my tech, Sam Ross, how to process video. So the cameras were great. The lights held up very well during, as I said, every storm that Colorado threw at them. All of the bomb cyclone hit them and knocked off 3 lights out of the 12 on one of the turbines and 2 lights out of 12 on another. But it was simply a matter of going up with the lift and reattaching them magnetically. They're mostly held on with 2 very strong magnets each and a little bit of foil tape, which is another great discovery I made on this project. So yeah, in general, the lights, the cameras, and the access cameras that we use, the thermal cameras, we've had them out under turbines all over the place in fields pointing upwards for years and haven't had any problems.
Great, thank you. The next question is, did you measure background light levels at the test turbines in an attempt to assess how much the UV lights changed visibility?
That is an excellent question, and no. Something we've been, Marcos and all of us really kind of had these conversations. That's one of the big variables is background, the ambient illumination levels, and there is UV at night a little bit in the landscape, and now we can actually see that with our cameras and the right filters, not getting that infrared pollution. But yeah, we have not yet addressed that systematically. I think it's very doable with simple long exposure cameras, the filters, and sort of quantifying background, image processing techniques can basically get us at least a relative measure. And we haven't moved towards more precise instruments for measuring ambient UV light because I have a tendency to try kludgy things first and simpler things. But yeah, that's a really good question because the context of how the light is on the wind turbines will change with ambient light. So the nights with more UV, like on a moonlit night, if there's more UV in the landscape, you would expect the contrasting light flickering all over the wind turbines to be less visible to bats. But we're kind of trying to operate at a disco show level a little above what that ambient variability might influence too much.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I think we're going to do one more question and then move on to Rob's presentation so we have enough time. And then if we have extra time at the end to circle back to a few questions that we didn't get to, we'll do that. And if not, we'll follow up with our presenters by email. So let's take one more question. How about, is it possible to scale this to other energy technologies like offshore wind or solar facilities?
Wait, did you say, is it possible to fail?
Sorry, scale this to other energy technologies.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, it's possible to fail too. Yeah, our intention is, that's kind of where we're headed and why I think, especially the automating the thermal imagery analysis is so exciting and so scalable, because basically right now we have these, thermal surveillance cameras that are built to work in all kinds of environments, and they do perform well. They have bomb-proof versions, explosion-proof for mines and things, but then they plug into Ethernet ports and can be, we happen to use laptop computers in the base of the turbine and plug them into the Ethernet ports of those, but there's no reason with the proper security and networking sort of firewalls in place that these couldn't be, directly piped into the turbine infrastructure and monitored. They're Ethernet cameras, basically. They're meant to do that. We've kept them off the grid for security and other reasons, simplicity. But yeah, as far as implementing these cameras, I don't know if anyone's tried it yet, but it wouldn't take much. It literally takes us 5-10 minutes to plunk one onto the side of a turbine and plug it in. That's something people could try. The automated processing software we're working on, and John Yarborough has really done an amazing job with the machine learning to sort of train an algorithm that works in real time. Our plan this year is to keep training those algorithms for both object detection and classification, and then move it onto the cameras. We can get into the software of the cameras and basically put the algorithm out front, so it's looking for bats and birds and insects, and we're not having to record and then take hard drives back to an office and have someone sit and look at them. I think that latter video, what to do with the video, is the biggest roadblock right now to scaling up to offshore and full wind facilities pretty easily. As far as the lights go, yeah, they're 16-volt low power systems, and it's really just simple UV technology, and I think the simple LED technology, and the team that's designing and building those and revising the design right now, and just have the final production-ready prototype or production-ready version are, they've designed them to dump all the power and heat that those things generate under different conditions. So I think they're ready for anything.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. If you could stop sharing your screen at the top there. I think up at the top of the webinar window, you should have something that says stop sharing your screen. Great, thank you. Okay, and we'll now turn over to Rob.
Hey,
And I'll
thanks.
let you know when we have your slides.
Okay, hold on just a second here. Do you see
All right,
anything?
looking good. Yep,
Okay.
they look good.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you about our TD&I project. I want to just mention here a few, and more specifically, some of the things that people have contributed to in relation to this project. Todd Preston is with USGS with me here in Bozeman, and is a very capable technological guy in terms of putting hardware together. And some of his work will be sort of shown off in terms of armoring our equipment against the harsh environment that you find at the Wind Technology Center that Bethany was describing, and also in data analysis. And then Bethany, I can't say enough. I mean, unlike Paul, up here in Bozeman, we're remote from the Flatirons Campus in Boulder, and so we rely on the folks at the Technology Center to keep things up and running when we're not around. And so Bethany was the primary contact for that, essentially turning our radar equipment on and off when the weather was unfavorable. So a big thanks to her. For acknowledgments, Paul has sort of a constant presence in terms of advice to me on bats as I slowly get pulled in that direction away from bird migration. And at NREL, Simon Tao was instrumental in helping us get landed on site again, and playing somewhat of a role in keeping things running in our absence. John Yarborough, these are names that Paul mentioned. And so I think it speaks to their contributions to our respective projects that they're coming up here again, did some programming and software development for us, not nearly as extensive as that for Paul, but nonetheless, we use his products even here right now as I speak. And Robert White, also another sort of programmer, software developer at NREL, was instrumental in getting some pilot work done for one of the components of what turned out to be part of our TD&I project. So starting in here, let's see, a little bit of background. This project, as implied from the title, centers around really the empowerment of NexRad as instrumentation that can help inform us on what the prospective impacts to flying animals may be from alternative energy. And there's some appeal to assessing this because it's an embedded system. It's maintained largely by NOAA. It's robust. It's, like I said, it's embedded. It's there. And so a lot of the infrastructure that might otherwise be required in the deployment of a national scale sensor has been done. So now we can focus on, like I say, assessing whether the system can be empowered to do double duty. In this case, for biological conservation in relation to birds and perhaps bats as well. And so in that sense, there are some lingering questions that have come up in the literature, whether or not this system can aid in informing siting for future wind energy development, quantify risk and exposure, and perhaps even inform real-time curtailment operations, which is the sort of shutting down or slowing down of turbines in the face of in this case, a threat to biological organisms. There's a lingering question as to whether or not we will be able to reliably distinguish between birds and bats using this system of weather radars. But nonetheless, in both cases, and this was from Bauer et al., the image to the right, indicates, and I've circled 4C there, which is just, this is a graphic taken from their paper, the hazards posed by tall structures to birds and bats. Bats are, this is considered a more urgent concern, but a not unurgent one for birds as well. And I'm talking here primarily about passerines, but this, of course, includes birds of prey and others that have had more high-profile issues associated with alternative energy. So, but it's unknown whether these applications are plausible. And so a variety of questions linger concerning whether we can even use NextRed to reliably discriminate vertebrates and invertebrates, and there's some developments in that regard we'll get into. How well we might be able to use sort of the broad brush vertebrate observations that NextRad weather radars are capable of detecting as an index for the presence of bats, which generally are much less, are expected to be, except in certain locations, much less populous in the airspace relative to their sort of avian cousins. And then most of this movement happens at relatively low altitude. NextRad is designed to detect, weather that's occurring very high in the atmosphere. So already we're pushing a little bit on the limits for the system by looking at low altitudes for bird and bat movement. If we're talking more specifically about trying to assess impacts at the rotor swept zone, the sort of that strata of airspace that's occupied by wind turbines, that's a real question as to whether or not the system has something to say about quantifying passage at those altitudes reliably in ways that can be sort of useful for the kind of work that we're proposing here. So this gets to our project goals. Apropos of knowing on radar systems what we're looking at, we sought to try to use both portable radars, one of which was located at the National Wind Technology Center, and the nearest NextRad to attempt to cross-corroborate their observations, both in terms of target classification and in terms of their ability to discriminate low-altitude targets. We want to also, and this is probably the centerpiece of the project, and we'll definitely be spending most of our time on this, extrapolate the near-field observations that we can get from NextRad at low altitudes to those places further away from these radar stations that are low altitude that the radars can't detect at all. And we'll get a little bit into the geometry of why that's an issue. And what we're really assessing here is the extent to which NextRad's observations at low altitude can be sort of projected, out into the space beyond its immediate view shed. If that works, will be how much wind energy coverage area across large parts of the United States could conceivably be indirectly covered or monitored by NextRad. And then finally, and this is an appealing, I think, element to our combined funding, when I say ours, mine's, and Paul's combined funding on these early TD&I projects, is that some of his observations may allow us to be able to determine whether or not radar technologies can be used to index bad activity. And so the observations essentially would serve as a proxy for bad activity. This is an open question. So since that proposal, there's been a lot of new science that's impacted directly the kinds of things that we're asking about. Obviously, tower height continues to increase, and so the operational rotor swept area, that altitudinal strata occupied by wind turbines, is a bit of a moving target, and we need to know that if we're trying to assess what sorts of airspaces NextRad needs to monitor. It's been speculated that curtailment of wind turbines, while demonstrated to be favorable for bats in terms of reducing their mortality, was likewise favorable to birds in reducing theirs, although recent research is suggesting that that may not be the case. More work needs to be done in this area. But in terms of using something like NexRad as a real-time, to inform, say, a real-time curtailment solution in relation to, say, vertebrates writ large, which for all practical purposes means generally birds, songbirds, that's now become an ambiguous question. Also there have been major advances in radar data processing in the past few years. I'll get into some of these. Amazon Web Services now serves data for free at high speed and also provides a processing platform. Target discrimination, a very important paper by Lynn et al. Called MISNet. Adrian Doctor, Sid Gotro, and myself have also made contributions to this area in terms of developing target discrimination algorithms using machine learning methods for NexRad data. And arguably one of the more important ones is the Rosenberg et al. 2019 paper that identified that over the past 40 or 45 years we've lost some nearly 30% of our avian fauna. This is probably going to change the nature of the conversations that we have in relation to sources of mortality for songbirds moving forward. And then a more specific case, a very sensitive issue associated with an offshore wind development in Lake Erie is kind of a potential manifestation of the concern that that we might be seeing in the future, for songbirds when data shows that the primary sources of anthropogenic human-sourced mortality for songbirds has been feral or free-ranging cats and glass impacts with glass. But nonetheless, this is an emotional issue for people, and so all sources of mortality become involved in the conservation question. And it's relevant here because Lake Erie, the area, as shown by this map, has far less bird migration traffic than we see in the Great Plains. And this map takes weather radar data accumulated across this approximately 20-year time frame, and is mapping out the migrant densities across the U.S. So we have an area in Lake Erie that's receiving relatively far fewer birds than the Great Plains, and yet is receiving a fair amount of attention in relation to wind energy for bird conservation. So getting to the meat of what we were doing, corroboration between radars. This is a work in progress, and the image here shows one of our portable radar units deployed at the Wind Technology Center. It was deployed for over a year. There's some specifications on the radar itself. We don't have to get into the details of that, but we gathered closing in on 4 terabytes of data from this instrument. And so we necessarily have to focus our analyses to certain times of the year to address certain questions. And we generally don't use all the data, even for those time frames that we're focusing on. We don't use all the data that we've gathered. We'll take a subset of it out because it's often sufficient. But we have that deep well to draw on if we need to really refine the data set and drill in hard on a very specific question that may involve a lot of filtering. We can dig back into the data set and increase our sample size if needed. For this corroboration, the nearest NexRad site is about 60 kilometers away, associated with the Denver airport. And like our radar for a year, but much more reliably, the NexRad at the airport was operating continuously, supposedly allowing for the kinds of corroboration that we were planning for here. So the portable radar uptime over the 11-month period is sort of mapped out here. You can essentially just pay attention to the green. We have some gaps in the data set that were associated, usually with intentional shutdowns. owing to weather and things of that nature. We had a couple failures, but by and large, the instrumentation was reliable and ran with relatively few hiccups. And this was our first, at least for my lab, our first attempt to deploy a unit in these sorts of conditions. And granted, it was attended, but in this way, intended to be relatively unattended. And so we feel that it sort of met our expectations in that regard. The red outline here indicates the data sets that we're sort of focusing on here in the near term, not only for association with bats, but also for association with NREL in relation to bird migration. With radar instrumentation, target classification is always an issue. And so we had to deal with some problems associated with system noise. And so we developed some machine learning algorithms to remove those. They perform very well, and there's noise in the periphery here that you can see will fade out and leave only the biological targets. This is the rejection algorithm working to remove noise. And likewise, we get weather. As the instrumentation is sitting out there, it encounters rain, snow, and all flavor of weather passing through. We trained against rain in particular, and for those cases, we were able to remove the vast majority. Here's what rain looks like when it's passing over the weather, the portable radar station. So good success on the classification algorithms for rejecting those events, and we can be very particular, not rejecting entire sort of coverages, but pieces, parts of coverage, so that we retain as much biological data as possible. When trying to distinguish, however, vertebrates from invertebrates, which usually means birds and bats, which are the things we're interested in, versus insects, which not to say that they're uninteresting, they are, but our focus here is on vertebrates. This is a work in progress, and I'll say more about this later. You're seeing an image, in this case, of an army cutworm moth migration in mid-June. This happens every June, and even into July. And then it happens again in September, thereabouts. And, for vertebrate work, this is a major source of noise, at least in gathering data in this manner. So we could conceivably use data like this, knowing that most of these things are moths as training data for building machine learning algorithms moving forward. We'll have to see. We haven't gotten there yet. In terms of target classification on NREL, this is not an atypical picture that one of these weather radars might capture of biology and precipitation are labeled there. And we've got algorithms that we can use to pull those pieces out with pretty good reliability. Distinguishing precipitation from biological sources of echoes in these radars is pretty reliable. The more subtle challenge of distinguishing the likes of insects from vertebrates is less so, and it remains widely a work in progress. At least a nuanced version of this is very much a work in progress. So we had trouble gathering reliable data from the Denver Airport weather radar, known as KTFG. The math suggested to us in advance that the Wind Technology Center would not be a source of clutter, which is to say, in particular, ground clutter. The ground can interfere with the signal, and what the weather radar operators do is apply these clutter rejection algorithms that voids data in those regions. This turned out to be a major concern for this area, and it may have been the turbines themselves that were contributing to it. We're not sure exactly what the cause is, but it also impacts our classification algorithms were also impacted here negatively. This gets a little bit technical. These are the three of the ways that the radar sees the world. The one that we're most familiar with is in the middle, called reflectivity. It's just the amount of stuff that's up there. In this case, we're looking at the same insect movement, moths, that I showed on the portable radar a few moments ago, as seen by weather radar. And when currently our algorithms anyway attempts to remove heavy, strong invertebrate movements by looking at them as generally weak echoes, which often they are, but not always, that have what we call very high differential reflectivity. And in those cases, those turn out to be pretty unreliable indicators for insect movement on the weather radar at Denver. And so there are some solutions to that we are exploring right now, but that part remains very much a work in progress. In terms of range extrapolation to the rotor swept zone, these radars are designed to see the world relatively close to the ground, or relatively high up in the air, excuse me. And so we have to be selective about the manner in which we approach low altitude assessment. So the profile that you're looking at here is the way one of these radars sees relatively low to the ground. And it's a very thin slice, given that the radars are able to detect precipitation that's many, many kilometers up into the airspace. And so that range here that we're looking at, of that altitudinal strata, identifies the rotor swept zone that we're using for this project, which is to say between 50 and 250 meters above the ground. This captures the rotor swept zones for turbines that are currently widely deployed, as well as those that we expect to be deployed more widely in the very near future. They're represented by their capacity, power generating capacities below. All of these turbines are in production. So anyway, the notion of the rotor swept zone is a bit of a moving target, and we have to keep an eye on it. But the challenge is for NexRad looking very low. And NexRad doesn't see low very far from its station. That's what that top figure indicates. So we're trying to determine whether those observations that we make near the radar station are applicable further away from it. And we do that, let's see here, by looking at a range of weather radar station pairs that vary in their distances from one another. So this is a NexRad map. You've seen it already. The dots that you see here are about 20 kilometers, 40 kilometers in diameter for reference. This is current wind energy development, and this is our study area. And you can see that it coincides, as does the wind energy development, very well, unfortunately, with the bulk of migratory movement that we see in the United States. So this is definitely the sweet spot to focus on. This gets a little technical. I'm going to move fast. We've already talked about largely about this. We do some ground clutter injection. We try to choose data between radar pairs that are, again, varying distance. We're comparing radar pairs. We're trying to correlate their observations, and we'll get to the details of that in a minute, but we want them to be occurring close in time. We reject weather. We try to reject, and there's a two-step process to that, and we try to take out insects, and there's a two-step process to that, and we can get into the details later if people have questions. We correlate, we capture data over a number of days between pairs of radars, again, that vary in distance from one another, and correlate them, okay? And theoretically, this degree of correlation should follow what people would call a sigmoidal function, or a function that has a sigmoidal in form. Don't get too used to this picture. The real data is a lot uglier. But very close to the radar, the observations that occur very close to a given radar, that is to say only a short distance away, should be very similar to the observations at the radar itself. And as you get further and further away, those observations should become decoupled from one another until they become completely decoupled and there's no relationship whatsoever. And at that point, we have zero correlation. This is what the correlation looks like between 210 pairs of NexRad stations that vary in their distances from one another. I mean, it's just a shotgun blast at this figure. We can see some consistencies in the sense that in the upper right of this figure, there are voids and strong correlations, and so consistent with the expectation, with the theory, we are moving toward essentially random associations between pairs, but this is occurring at extremely long ranges, 1,500 kilometers or so. Likewise, in the lower left portion of the image, we have voids in low correlations. There's absence of data there. That is in turn consistent with what we would expect for correlations near the radar. So the broad pattern is reasonable, and the relationship here is significant, but it's meaningless for its scale. So radar stations tend to be no more than 230 kilometers from one another on average. There's a lot of variation around that. So that's the absolute, technically that's the longest, or some extension there, modest extension thereof should be the longest we would need to try to extrapolate out into the surrounding airspace from a given radar. So we look again at that same data set, but we're clipping it off at 500 kilometers because we simply don't need to look very far. And the reason why we don't need to look very far is because you get to another radar station. So our interpolation is really concerned, almost ideally, with with what's going on within maybe 100 or 150 kilometers, sort of the maximum distance you would go before you get to a spot between two radars. Well, no radars are positioned that way, so we have to extrapolate a function. So this relationship is highly significant. We can get into people have questions about the function, we can get into that. It's forced through Pearson's R at 1.0 at a range of 0, as it should be. But we have a fair amount of variation. And so this variation is fine if we're just trying to, over time, stack up what the density expectations are out to a certain range from the radar to get a sense, say, for sighting or risk/collision assessment. If you're trying to do real-time, however, if you're trying to do real-time curtailment, then the variation that we get, and the reason why we see this variation, which is represented by the red lines here, is associated with a lot of day-to-day variation in the correlation between pairs. That's really, with so much variation, you really can't do real-time curtailment at any great distance from the radar station itself. So why do we see this distribution, or why are we seeing this pattern? I can tell you from just the analysis itself, weather matters, and we've seen fronts pass between two stations such that the intensities, these are weather fronts, such that the intensities of biological echoes are caused to vary over very short distances. And so that's one of the reasons you get this sort of lateral structure in weather, even within a day. Relief and terrain varies. And so animals that are, say, paying attention to an altitudinal strata of good migration weather that is not bound to the surface of the Earth will be flying higher over some places and lower over others. And that will tend to introduce noise into this relationship. So the relationship may be better if we're looking at height above sea level as opposed to above the ground, which of course is what's relevant for wind energy. There's probably some inherent structure at work here explaining the variation. Places where migration just occurs more and less, and we kind of got a feel for that in one of the previous images. Our sample size is relatively modest. Once we did all the filtering, and we did an awful lot, we got down to about 15.5 days on average per radar pair. That we can address, and something we're looking forward to here. So what's our extrapolation look like based on the function you just saw? Well, the green dots cover about 0.8% of the turbines in the 11 states that our study area span. If we do our cutoff at a Pearson's correlation of 0.9, we cover 41% of the turbines in these states, recognizing that we did not analyze all the data from NEXRADS from all the far reaches of these states. So some of the turbines we're including here as uncovered, but we also didn't try to cover them. And then finally, if we accept that Pearson's R of 0.8, our coverage is nearly uniform across the area, 90% of the stations, again, recognize with that caveat that I just mentioned. So, further analysis, increased sample size. We also want to revisit our approach to target discrimination. It is extremely conservative. And another way of increasing sample size would be to assess whether or not we're actually being too restrictive in terms of identifying, making our vertebrate-invertebrate discrimination. There's some advanced modeling methods that we can apply to improve this, which I won't get into right here. This is all fall data that we're looking at from 2018. There's a lingering question as to whether spring matters. Flight heights do vary seasonally, and there's a sort of a seasonal geographic interaction that explains flight height, as Adrian has shown, Adrian Doctor, in his paper in 2018. And then we can also just approach this from a completely different methodology, and that is interpolation. And we've done that here. We started that process rather than extrapolate, and these two things are related at some level, but rather than develop an extrapolation model, we can build an interpolation model. So, for example, the centrally located radar here, we can use the force surrounding it to guess what the migration or movement intensity is at that center radar, and then check it with the center radar itself. So we're working on those models actually as I speak here. So looking ahead, we haven't gotten to the point where we can address whether NEXRAD or portable radar observations can index bat abundance. Bat concerns are a major conservation issue, so we do want to pursue this question. Birds and bats may share similar drivers. At least that would be the hope. And if so, then maybe there's some chance that we can use radar observations to index bats. We're going to look more closely at the Denver NEXRAD and try to find some proxy data sets that are relatively nearby but lack the clutter issues that we saw. We may be able to relate fatality search data, historic fatality search data, to historically gathered NEXRAD determined densities at rotor swept zones. It's one thing to assess whether or not you have animals at the rotor swept zone at a certain height, wherever you are. It's another thing altogether to ascertain whether there's actual mortality. So we should try to see if these two are linked. And then we really need to make more progress on target discrimination on portable radar. We took a stab at this as part of our TD&I project. Maybe made about 10 or 15 or 20% progress along the way to build some very robust vertebrate versus insect target discrimination algorithms that are based on wing beats. This is the state of the art right now. So this is the direction that I would like to head if we're able to build this out, and it would lay open a lot of possibilities for us, preventing estimation bias in weather-related in radar-related studies, assessing impact of wind energy. There may tend to be, depending on the nature of the radar and analysis, an overestimation of vertebrate abundance if invertebrates, which are very easily detected, as you saw on these portable radars, are counted inadvertently as vertebrates. Quantifying insect abundance, which we should be able to do with this capability, would be instrumental in assessing what the food base is in relation to as a potential driver for bat abundance, which is again something that we could a datum that we could relate to Paul's observations from thermal imaging of bat activity at turbines, and then cross validation. This is getting back to that, one of our goals for the project is to cross-validate target discrimination. We can do a better job of that if we have better algorithms available for us in portable radar. Some final thoughts. This is the last slide. In the wake of Rosenberg 2019, songbirds are probably going to be a bigger issue. And even if other sources of mortality, like, again, cats and glass are the primary drivers of we think of anthropogenic avian mortality. But if we can build out this capability, we may be able to more directly estimate these fatalities at these regional or national scales. We have some work to do refining the relationship, but I'd say this early result looks quite promising because there are a lot of things that we can do to improve the relationship in terms of the extrapolation or the interpolation that I was talking about. Excuse me, applications, as mentioned earlier, include safer turbine operation for bats, some low-impact sighting. However, however, the Great Plains are affected really in their entirety, but build-out is likely to continue. And then quantify or forecast impact as a way potentially to estimate offsets if we ever move to a program along those lines where resources from one associated with one impact can be used to offset maybe a more consequential impact like bats and glass. And with that, I'll conclude and take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. So we're over our time by a couple minutes. Are you available to stay on for a couple more minutes and take a question or two?
Oh, yeah.
Great. So for anyone who needs to drop off, I just want to reiterate that we are recording this presentation. We will post it on the NWCC website. So if you're not able to stay for the Q&A, you will be able to see this recording. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them in because we're going to take a couple more minutes here to answer a few questions. And the first question we have is, for NextRed offshore wind with 12 to 14 megawatt turbines, how far out can it go and how does turbine size affect it?
I'd have to do the specific math on how far out we could see these very high megawatt turbines. So the issues there are how far out is, how tall is the turbine, how far offshore is the turbine, and how far onshore is the NextRed station, and how high above the plane of the ocean is the NextRed station. Some of them are sitting on bluffs, which makes them almost automatically unusable for this sort of thing. So I know from looking at stations associated with the coast of California in particular that there are 3 radars that do provide some level of coverage, but only one provides relatively low altitude levels of coverage. So I would again, without doing the specific math on this, despite the fact that these offshore turbines are much larger often, I would wager that our NextRed coverage is generally going to be pretty modest. That said, it's entirely possible, and I didn't have time to get into this, that estimates of high altitude movement observed on NextRed may, at longer ranges, may index what's going on at lower altitudes at longer ranges. That's an analysis we can conduct, and we just haven't had a chance to do that. So, in that circumstance, if the radar may not be able to detect, even the nearest shore radars may not be able to detect low altitude movements over open water. They may be able to index low altitude movements over open water by looking at sort of these higher altitudes.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take one more question, and there's a note here that there's a concern about lack of bat data offshore, and the question is there anything we can do in the short and medium term to get better offshore bat data?
Yeah, it is a concern. There has been some research gathering offshore bat data using acoustics. Others have floated literally the idea of doing transect surveys on boats, again, using acoustics and monitoring bats, using various forms of radio tagging. But I agree with the questioner that this is an area of concern. and in large part because it's just a hard place to look. Paul, do you have anything, if you're on and able to pipe in, do you have anything to say about bats and offshore wind?
I think you just hit on the information we have, and I'm not aware of anyone that's tried offshore thermal video. There have been, actually there are some studies where they've done thermal imaging offshore for birds and bats in boat surveys, and but it isn't the kind of continuous at a wind turbine watching that are the kinds of observations we're shooting for. You know, we're at these wind turbines. An example is 6 months of video monitoring we did on Hawaii on 4 wind turbines, continuous every night. I think the bats were actually present in the scene 0.8% of the time, less than 1% of the time. So these are really rare events, even if they are going to be important when they do happen. So yeah, I don't think we yet have that information, but Rob and I have worked a lot at wind turbines and solar towers, trying to kind of come up with methods of doing these cross-validation studies, and offshore is one we just haven't seen people get to yet. But yeah, coupling thermal imagery with radar at offshore should be feasible, at least the thermal imagery with the magnetic approach we're taking. You know, it doesn't matter, you can put the cameras as high as you need them on the turbine to get a relevant view. The camera height, the bat, it's just limited to the distance the bat is in the pixel resolution, which isn't high definition, but you know, you slide the cameras up the tower 50 meters, you're probably going to see all the bats in the upper rotor slip zone on even the biggest turbine. So, but yeah, it's a big concern, and we don't really know. And Rob and I wrote a chapter on analyzing bat migration in the book back in 2007, and you know, we basically laid out, like, we don't know what bats look like on radar when they're migrating, because we don't know what bats look like when they're migrating. So we can't really call these birds and bats with high confidence, and we're still in the same boat.
Right.
Well, thanks for responding to that, and I think we'll have to wrap up there. I do want to note that we had a few other questions and comments come in. So what we'll do is share these with the speakers and then send around an email to everyone who registered for this webinar with the answers to the questions that we didn't get to. So thank you so much to both of our speakers. Really appreciate it. Great to see those preliminary results. And thanks to Bethany for the introduction and helping to organize these presentations. And thanks to everybody for joining. So everyone have a great day. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.